One night, a few years ago, I sat down on the couch and YouTube had a recommendation for me. A video about a beautifully lit, eerily empty subway station. Glossy ceramic tile, flickering overhead lights, the camera pushing in slowly. Except the subway station wasn't real. It was just realistic. Photorealistic, actually, which was the whole point of the video. How to make a photorealistic subway station in Blender. At the time, I had never heard of Blender. I also knew nothing about photorealistic rendering, and now that I've rewatched the video, it doesn't look all that photorealistic. But it was intriguing enough, so the next day I downloaded Blender, and I was soon coming up with excuses to use Blender for work.
In May of 2018, in the darkened living room of a low-slung ranch house somewhere in the San Fernando Valley, a middle-aged man reverently lifted a heavy black box from a coffee table.
In 2018, Goodhertz released an audio plugin called Megaverb, which was inspired by the exuberant digital reverbs of the 1980s. So we made a little backstory video for the plugin about how we got the hardware that we based the initial modeling on.
He paused, then blew dust and cat hair from the surface, revealing a grid of adjectives printed in white text and repeating in strange patterns. Large, medium, small, large, medium, warm, bright, dark, bright, warm, small, medium. This was it. This was what Goodhertz co-founder Devin Kerr had come here for. A digital reverb from the golden age of primitive computers, the 1980s. Inside this machine, the enthusiasm of an entire decade. Inside this machine, a ghost waiting to be conjured, hoping to live again in the 21st century. Devin held out his hands to accept the box. He received it, turning it to inspect the wear and tear. He noticed there was no power supply. "Is there a power supply?" he asked. "Ah, yes," the man said. He spun around and opened a drawer, picking out a strange rectangle. "I wired this one myself." Devin raised an eyebrow, skeptical. "Don't worry," the man said. "It's better than the original." Better than the original. The phrase was familiar somehow. Uncanny, like a transmission from the near future. Months later, after he and the Goodhertz engineering team had coaxed that ghost from the dusty black box and given it new life in thousands of lines of intricate code, that phrase rang once again in Devin's head. Better than the original. He brought up the new plugin on his computer and sent the sound of a tom-tom through it. Then the sound of a snare. Then the sound of a synthesizer. Megaverb. Incredibly good, bad reverb. By Goodhertz.
Making this video was fun, but it was also a little exhausting. Blender's typography support is not great. Right off the bat, there is no support for kerning, of all things. So all the big words set here in Rage Italic, these had to be set in Illustrator, then exported to SVG, imported, resized, extruded. Not the end of the world, but creatively limiting when it's so time-consuming. By the time I finished the last scene, I really wanted nothing to do with Blender ever again. So I went back to the world of 2D, and this time I was determined to figure out how to ease the workflow a little bit. So I set about learning Drawbot properly, which I did, and it changed my life. Prior to Drawbot, I'd programmed in a lot of languages and graphical frameworks, but none of them made as much sense to me as this little app, particularly when it came to typography. Drawbot has drawbacks, but it's an excellent program. From there, butting up against some of those drawbacks, mostly having to do with animation, I started working on my own Python-based creative coding library, which is called ColdType. Here's a little live coding with ColdType. Today ColdType's an open source library, but for a long time it was a personal project, tailored to my own creative needs, something that I'd tinker on from time to time. After a while, though still during that pre-open source era of ColdType, James Edmondson, aka Ono Typeco, asked me if I wanted to do a video for the release of his new typeface, Obviously. I did, obviously, and enough time had passed since my last Blender project that I thought, nice, this is an opportunity to do some more 3D stuff. The basic idea: James would design a small commercial corridor, based loosely on where he lives in Oakland, and I would animate all the signs to be either 2D variable font animations or extruded 3D typography, all done with variations of Obviously, including the little bits of graffiti on the exterior walls. And then the camera would move around in the little 3D world. This took me so long that it held up the release of the font, sorry James, and then when it was actually finished, the video seemed to make very little impact on the font buying public, sorry again James. But it really does feel to me like basically the coolest thing I've ever made.
So I'm like a huge sign painting fan, but secretly I also really dig like vinyl signage, and particularly when it's like peeling up on the edges and kind of cracking, or some of these businesses will take like impact and make it super wide, or take antique olive Nord and just squish it like super narrow, and I kind of dig that stuff. And then you have the whole genre of like hemp con, tattoo con, those sorts of gnarly billboards with like black type, all fully justified on like a neon green background. I really love that stuff, so I wanted to do something with those things in mind, but it totally got out of hand and ended up being like 96 style. But because of that, and because of the ability to switch the terminals, you can really do a lot of different things with it. And I could imagine it in use for like the nail salon, or the laundromat, or just like the neighborhood mechanic. But any place where you don't want to go for like the subtle thing, and instead you want to communicate obviously.
Of course, after making that video, I wanted nothing to do with Blender, so once again, I went back to 2D to refocus my effort on tidying up ColdType so that I could open source it, which I did in late 2019. Still, my interest in Blender kept coming back. Its photorealism was so real and so immediate. I just couldn't stay away. So after a few months of 2D, I was back at it once again in 3D, this time getting ColdType to interoperate with Blender's excellent Python API. This let me control Blender with ColdType, meaning I could quickly and easily build 3D text with a live coding setup, and crucially, without relying on any of Blender's native typography support at all. And at that point, live coding Blender from ColdType, the whole world of typography opened up. Whatever Harfbuzz could shape, I could render in Blender. Variable fonts were the first on the punch list. Photographing typography was next up. I've always loved shallow depth of field on real-life cameras, and using the virtual camera in Blender is no exception. Dialing in focus on a sharp edge is always thrilling. Another thing I love to do in Blender, photographing the warped reflection of text. And now we come to my absolute favorite thing to do, set text and then enable what Blender calls rigid body physics. This short film is not really type per se, but it was coded entirely with cold type in Blender. and the arches themselves are just segmented Bezier curves, so about as close to type as you can get without being illegible. Plus some of the shapes look like capital M's. I think what I find so fascinating about these physics simulations, and what keeps me coming back to them, is that you're essentially just creating a single frame of content, a static design, and then letting Blender's physics engine do its thing, kind of like aleatoric music but for graphic design. The motion is just the result of that single composition, a little bit of controlled chaos, which is not something you usually associate with typography. After all that experimenting, I finally started using ColdType in Blender to make commercial work for Goodhertz. Here are a few fun videos, all done entirely in code, except for the placement of the cameras. So this took up quite a bit of my time, tinkering with the ColdType to Blender workflow. The only trouble, when people asked me how they could also do it, I'd try to help them get it all set up. But the setup process was extremely difficult because it meant connecting a working ColdType installation with a working Blender application. This meant navigating different Python installations, different Blender configurations, maybe even a little homebrew, potentially downloading some C headers to fill out some missing ones in the Blender embedded Python library. It goes on. And then there's knowing how to use Blender itself, which is no small feat, and knowing how to program Python using ColdType, again, not even close to a small feat. As soon as I'd do a video chat with someone to help them get it working, I got the sense that they'd understandably probably never try this again. So after months, maybe even a year of wondering how I could better help people do three-dimensional typography using ColdType and Blender, I realized I could just make a GUI Blender add-on. A real moment of enlightenment. Why not make it easy for people rather than just easy for me? Incredible breakthrough. So a few months ago, I started work on what I was calling ColdType for Blender due to its close relationship with ColdType, the Python programming library. But that turned out to be a little confusing, so these days I'm calling it ST2. ST2 is a Blender add-on that makes it easy to set type in 3 dimensions, with support for all the modern bells and whistles, including dialing in variable font axes and keyframing them, on a timeline. No coding required, though you will have to learn Blender, which has a shallower learning curve than coding, though still a little steep. But if you like photorealism, I know it'll be worth it to spend a couple of weeks learning the Blender fundamentals. How does ST2 work? A lot like anything else in Blender. Here's a demo of ST2 in action. Thinking what needs to happen here is different background color, and then if we go in to the rigid body settings for the plane in the background, we can make it kind of slippery, which is a cool air hockey table. That doesn't look like an air hockey table, but I think if we make it a little smaller, bring it up way high to increase the impact of the impact. There we go, you can see a little bit floating around, flipping and floating. So you're entering the, make it heavy again, and then bring it down. Ah, there you go. Floating away. But physics isn't the only thing you can do, so let's get rid of that. Bring it down. Make it a little bit smaller, and then if you duplicate it and change the variable font settings, nudge it down a little bit. If you select both of these, then you get a little new menu to interpolate between those two. And that's what that is, a little staircase of interpolated strings. And you can interpolate them even more than that. There's another staircase with more steps. It's pretty fun. ST2 also supports more classic variable font animations. Bring that one back to the center, then head into the timeline. Keyframe the weight axis, duplicate that one for a loop, and then change another keyframe to a heavy setting. And there you go. You can also set the weight offset, it's a generic feature for any axis, so that the variation will change across the letters in the string. That's pretty fun. Anyway, that's ST2. If you want to find out more about ColdType and ST2, you can head to https://coldtype.xyz. And thank you for watching.